bisschen ins Mikrofon reinredest.
Ich kann es versuchen.
Genau. Wenn ich hinten dran anfange, ein bisschen so machen, dann das Mikrofon.
Ja, Bergen kann man es nicht länger machen, dass das ist.
Das ist nur für kleine Leute denkt.
Okay.
Entschuldigung, kurz.
Genau, ein bisschen neu.
Also Stichsäge hätte, dann könnte man da noch eins runterlassen.
Genau. Oder vielleicht auch einfach den ganzen Tisch eins auflöpfen. Genau. Ein paar Bücher drum, ein paar Laptops.
Genau, aber das ist gut.
Ich versuche es.
Das ist gut.
Sonst aber versuchst du irgendwie zu winken oder so.
Auch wenn es weit weggeht, nimmst du einfach das Ding mit. Da. Schaut das noch schnell ein. Genau.
Ist gut. Ich habe nicht vor, rumzulaufen, aber es ist gut.
Wie?
Ich habe nicht vor, rumzulaufen, aber es ist gut.
Genau.
Okay. Then I guess we can get started. Welcome to my presentation about Drupal workflows for contributors and maintainers. Very quickly about me. You probably most of you know me. My name is Sascha Grossenbacher. I work at Embedded Systems, Tier on Drupal.org. I'm Drupal core entity system maintainer. I maintain lots of country modules, and I'm contributing to Drupal for 16 years now. I'm getting old. I'm going to talk about issues, not too much. I thought there are other issues that are going to focus on issue queue. I'm just doing some basics, metadata. Focus is then on patches and merge requests, on GitlabCI, the fancy new tool that we have on Drupal.org, and then basically for maintainers, release management about branches and commits and stuff like this. So this presentation is based on my personal opinions, on my experience. Not all maintainers work the same way, so if you have different issue queues, different maintainers, things might be different. Issues. If you create a new issue on Drupal.org, I think quite a few of you have done that, then you're greeted with this screen. There are a lot of fields here, lots of things to fill out, and some of these are not quite obvious. So I'm just quickly going to talk about a few of these fields and what you should do there and what you shouldn't do. For the very basics, currently issues on Drupal.org is Drupal. It's notes and comments, nothing too special in the basic thing. Those meta fields are on the node, and then you can comment, you can update them, which updates the node. It's mostly used to track and discuss code-related stuff. For support, it's better to use some other platforms. You can use it, but you will probably not get useful answers in a meaningful time. There are very different rules for Drupal core and contrib. Core mostly has more rules, more specific processes and workflows. Contrib is up to the maintainer. Going through the fields, so the title should be a short description of your problem, of your feature request. It's usually becoming the commit message, so keep that in mind. Try to keep it a bit short and descriptive. The priority is often misused. Basically, you should only change it to major or critical according to defined rules. On the screen, you can see a link below that explains which issues are critical. To summarize it, it's the importance of the issue to the project, not to you. If you take the time to report it, it makes sense that it's important for you, but that doesn't mean it's important for everyone. If you're not sure, just leave it on default. For the status, there are a few more, but these four is the basic workflow. A new issue starts as active. When you contribute something that's usually a patch or a merge request, then it needs review, but it can also be an image or whatever. If there is feedback from tests, from user reviews, it's set back to its work, which indicates that there needs to be more stuff done it. And then eventually it's getting, for anything that's code changes, it's getting set to fixed when committed by the maintainer. And then 2 weeks later, it's automatically set to closed fixed. The idea is that fixed issues remain visible in the issue queue. So for 2 weeks, you can, if other users have the same problem, they see it, they don't have to create a duplicate issue, and then it's getting closed. Only really helps if you do releases in a timely manner, but it's something. Then the version, there's a very, very long list in the version field by most projects. Almost always just use the development branch. You can see that on a project page, below the release info, you usually see the development branch mentioned. Almost always use that. There is really no reason to use anything else, unless there is very, very, very specific use case. For Drupal core, it's a bit more complicated. Development happens in the 11.x branch, which now really is Drupal 11, but for the last 2 minor releases, it was really Drupal 10. It was just the main branch is a blog post linked here. What I forgot to mention, we'll show it again at the end. The slides are all online. You can look at them there, so you don't have to write down links or anything. You can look it up then on the generated slides. The reason for this is related to merge requests and branches and so on, but just keep in mind for Drupal core, if you report a new issue, almost always use 11.x. And then maintainers will decide how far that's backported to Drupal 10.3, 10.2, if it's a bug fix, whatever. Tags should only be used for specific defined purposes. So there's a list linked here again of common tags for things like needs tests or needs accessibility review. If you're not sure what to put in there, just ignore it. For components, Drupal core has component-specific maintainers, the entity system maintainers and maintain themes and other modules. So there, it's quite important to pick the correct component, but it's, even for me, still, after 16 years, sometimes hard. So don't worry too much about it, pick something. If it's not correct, someone will fix it. And for most country projects, most don't use components at all. There's just not enough. There are not multiple maintainers in most cases, so just pick code or ones. There are a few default ones, just pick one of those. For the assignee, only if you're a maintainer of the project, you can assign an issue to someone else. As a regular contributor, you can just assign it to yourself or unassign it. And you should only assign it when you work on the issue. So if you report a bug or something, don't assign it to yourself, just leave it unassigned. For the issue summary, you saw in the screenshot, there's a template, there's like a problem description, steps to reproduce, and the proposed resolution. So these are the 3 most important ones. If you have stuff to fill in there, do that. It's especially helpful to have clear steps on how to reproduce a bug. So that's really useful. And if you see a large issue with many comments that seems to be a bit derailed, it can be a very useful contribution to read through the comments, update the issue summary, put together like these are the 2 proposals that people are working on. That helps a lot for maintainers to not have to read 50 comments. And Outlook, issues will move to Drupal, to GitLab, away from Drupal itself. That's happening as part of the switch of Drupal org to Drupal 10. And that's it already for issues. Now a bit more about patches. So just for the very basic explanation, a patch file describes changes to the source files. Basically, it says which lines are removed and which lines are added. And when working in issues and working in Drupal, each patch describes the full set of changes that should be done against the target branch. And the problem is that these patches can get quite big. They can have hundreds of lines of changes. And if someone requests a small change and you update it or someone updates it, then it can be annoying to find if the change was correctly done. And for that, there are the concept of interdivs, which is basically a div between patches. And then you can basically just review, so you review a patch, you give feedback, someone updates it, then you can check the interdiv if your suggestions were correctly implemented. So if you work on an existing issue, update the patch, it's useful to include an interdiv. That said, patches will in the next months mostly go away, replaced by merge requests. But it's helpful to understand the concept still. The current collaboration process with patches is that the patch is uploaded in an issue, someone reviews it, it's being tested, and then the patch is updated, there's an interdiv, and then this is repeated until the whole thing is committed. This can take sometimes a long time. There are some things that are in some ways, I think, somewhat unique to Drupal.org, in the way that open source development and contribution works. There are a lot of different people involved. So in other projects, often it's one person doing a suggestion, a merge request, it's merged, and then it's done. In Drupal, I just saw yesterday a comment from Alex Pott that there are 5.6 contributors per Drupal core issue. It's different for contrib, of course, but for core, there are lots of people involved, and it's taking a lot of time. That's on one side nice and interesting, many people are working on it. It's also one reason is that it often takes a long time. So someone starts, and then it gets lost, and then someone picks it up again, and so on. But I think we're improving recently a bit. There are a number of tools to work with this process, like the editor, which is a Firefox extension that allows you to review a patch and leave comments on specific sections. And this process, this workflow has been used for, I don't know, 20 years at this point or more. And the versioning, the tooling changed from CVS originally. When I started, it was still CVS, to our own Git hosting solution, now to GitLab. And it's changing now. And because people are used to this process, there is some resistance from some people, some discussions. But I think merge requests have some very interesting advantages over this. Another special thing is that most of us are quite used to using patches in projects. So many of us used to compose a patches project. If you don't, I will talk about it a bit later. But because of this sometimes slow process, we often have 1, 2, 10, 20, 50 patches in our projects to get it to work the way we need it to, we want it to. So merge requests and called pull requests on GitHub. We're shifting to that. One reason is that it's being enforced because we're removing our own custom-built CI solution with GitlabCI, and that does not support patches. So one important takeaway from this session is if you contribute from now on, use merge requests, don't use patches anymore. It's basically the same process, but it's more structured, more formal, more organized. So it's based on a Git branch, which is the patch, and then there are specific commits, which are kind of like an interdiv. And it's the standard contribution process for many open source projects. So the idea and hope is that it will be easier for developers new to Drupal and also for non-developers to use this process to contribute to Drupal. Because one advantage is that you can also combine it with the GitLab UI. So if you just want to fix a typo, if you want to update the README file, write documentation, you can do that in user interface. You can start a branch, you can edit the file, you can commit it, you can merge it. You don't ever have to touch the console if you don't want to. There is one interesting major limitation of the merge request workflow, and that is that usually if you're not a maintainer, before you can do a merge request, you fork the project. That means it's then your fork, and only you are allowed to commit. As we saw, in Drupal, on average, 5 people contribute to an issue. So that's a bit of a problem, and it can be a problem if someone starts contributing and then just stops and doesn't work on that anymore. So Drupal.org developed a solution for this problem, and it's called issue forks. So instead of forking into your own repository, the fork is created for a specific issue. I will show on the next screens how that looks like, how this process works. So the first person who wants to work on an issue starts the issue fork, and then you can just press a button and you can push that as well. There's still some restrictions, some things that don't quite work properly, like changing the merge request target and some weird things around review comments, but that's being improved. I saw some blog posts from GitLab itself that they're working a similar concept called community forks, but it's still somewhat controlled and restricted, but still it's an issue for other projects as well, and it's being worked on. So the way this works is that when you have an issue that doesn't have an issue fork yet, you have this user interface, this widget. And it's very simple, you just have a button to create the issue fork. Optionally, you can also create a branch for you, and you can adjust the name if you want to. If you look at an issue that has an existing issue fork, then it looks a bit like this, and there's quite a lot of information packed in here, so let's unpack this a bit. On the top, you can see the link to the repository, and next to it, the button to get access. So if you want to contribute there, press the button, and you can commit. Then below is one or multiple branches, and the first link goes to the branch, so you can then edit the file or do something there. Then there is a changes link, that's the diff, so you can look at the changes there. That's especially useful if there's no open merge request yet. If there's a merge request, you can see it afterwards with the merge request number, and you can also click on that to go to the merge request. If the project is using GitlabCI, you can see the red icon for failing tests or the green checkbox if the tests are passing. The test results below, the green and red line, those are from the old DrupalCI information that will be removed soon for our projects. More on that a bit later. And one last link that I didn't mention yet is the show commands up in the corner. That's really nice. So when you press that, it looks like this. So you have two new gray boxes, and you can just copy-paste the commands you need to get that repository into your checkout. So the first one, there are two options. One is if you have SSH keys or not. Usually you have, and then you can just pick the first one. There's a copy icon in the corner that you can just press, paste, and then pick the branch you want to work on, copy-paste this, paste, and you can start working. So it just takes 2 copy-pastes, and you can start working on an issue. When you look at the merge request UI, it looks like this. I'm not going too much into details here. You have tabs on top. You can switch between the overview. There are commits. So if you want to look at the intermediate changes, you can look at the commits. There are pipelines. I will get to that. That's the GitlabCI stuff. And the changes is basically all the code changes of this merge request. Below is mostly stuff about the GitlabCI process. You can see that in this case, stuff is failing. It's red. We'll explain more on that later. The changes tab looks like this, which most of you probably have seen in some form or other on GitHub, on GitLab. You can click on a line, you can leave a comment, give feedback on the code changes, and then that can be discussed in scope of that code change. So usually with patches and issues, it was often challenging to keep track of those code reviews and figure out which comment has been resolved and what not, and what's being discussed. It was distributed among many comments. And now you can have one thread for each change you want to discuss it there, and at the end it can be marked as resolved. In case you don't know about the Composer Patches project, so basically what it allows you to do is use a patch in your project. So the reason you're contributing, that you're developing this, is probably in many cases that you want to use it in your project. You found a bug, you want to have a new feature, and then you can use this to, while it's still being reviewed and tested and finalized, still use it in your project. You just require it like any other project, and then you make a few changes to your composite JSON file. The first one, I think, is self-explaining. You enable the process. I think if you have patches in the top level, you don't even need this, but it also supports patches from dependencies, and then you think you need it. The next one I think is important. Basically, it makes your Composer install fail if the patches don't apply. The default behavior is it will just finish Composer install, and especially for like an automated build process and platform SH or some other infrastructure hosting, it will just deploy your project. But if a patch fails to apply, your project is probably broken, and you don't want this to go to production. So this makes sure that the process is aborted, that the project is not deployed, and that you can resolve it. It's sometimes a bit annoying if you like do a big update and you have 10 patches that need to be updated, some are removed and so on. Then I temporarily switch it off. Then I see it, all the changes, all the problems, I fix them, and then I switch it back. The next one is the patch level. So Drupal core is special because Drupal core is a automatically updated subtree split. So the Drupal project has core among other folders, but the Drupal core dependency that you use in your project is just the core folder. And that's separate, and patches that are done on Drupal.org have an extra folder in them that you need to remove. So the P2 ensures that this is correctly applied. It still works if you don't include it, because composer patches will just try a few settings until your patch applies. But if you don't include it, you might end up with extra AB folders and files in your project. So if you were wondering about those, that's the reason, and this is how to get rid of it. You usually only need this for Drupal core. And then you have the patches themselves. It's a list of projects. Each project can have multiple patches. The first part is the description. The second part is the URL or the local file name. You can use whatever you want for the description. We usually use the issue number and the description in there. Then you can also put the files in the patches in a separate file. That's useful because then it doesn't update your log file if you had to remove a patch. Up to you. Merge requests can also be used as patches. What's very important here is that you don't use them directly. As we mentioned before, everyone can commit to a merge request. If you directly include the patch of a merge request, the URL in your project, then I can just go to Drupal.org issue, get access, write any code, and the next time you build your project, it will run my code on your website. That's not great. So download it locally. You can use, for example, a curl command like this that stores the file locally. So what I forgot to mention is that you can just add .diff to the URL of a merge request, and then you get the diff file. Use diff, don't use patch, because patch gives you a diff for each commit, and that sometimes doesn't apply anymore. So to work on a merge request or an issue in your project, so usually you work on your project, you update the module, you find a bug, or you work on a feature and you find a bug. Then there's a very neat command from Composer that is Composer install combined with prefer source. So you can switch basically any local module you have to a Git checkout with a single command. Then you switch into that project. You copy-paste the two commands from the issue after, if necessary, create an issue, start an issue fork, and then you just copy-paste those commands, and then do your stuff. What did I do? Wrong button. Make your changes, test them, whatever, then commit and push them, and update the merge request, create it if necessary, and update the issue, leave comments there that what you did. So I think this workflow works really well. And then afterwards, if you want to use it, add or update your patches definition in your project. So Drupal CI to GitLab CI. A little bit of history. Drupal CI was originally developed around 2007, the first version. It was called Project Issue File Test back then. There was a second iteration that was more or less custom built, I think. And there was a second iteration around 2014 that used Jenkins and Docker containers. So since then, we are able to test different PHP versions, different database backends, and that really, really helped us to make sure that we always claimed that PostgreSQL works, but for a very long time it didn't really work that well. And finally we could run all our tests against PostgreSQL and against SQLite, and actually make sure that this stuff is working. It has very limited flexibility. You could do a few things. You could include a file and adjust some of the actual testing process, but a lot of stuff around was limited to default modules that used PHP extensions, JavaScript libraries, stuff like this. There were not a lot of options for you. It's deprecated, and it's replaced with GitlabCI now. GitlabCI is the standard continuous integration system of GitLab that's used by a lot of people using GitLab. So it's not developed by us. It's no longer a lot of time needs to go into maintaining it, not our own software, our own servers and so on. Well, servers, yes, but not our own software. As mentioned, it does not support patches. So if you upload patches to an issue, they can no longer be tested. Pipeline is basically the thing that's running on each commit, on each merge request. It's a set of jobs. And each job is a set of commands. Those commands run usually in a container, in a Docker container, and they can use service containers, for example, MySQL, Redis, but also the Chrome browser that's used for JavaScript testing, that's also a service container. And jobs have dependencies, so we'll get to that in a second, but basically before a certain job can run, some other job needs to run that maybe builds the project, and then you can run the tests. It's scalable. It runs on the Drupal.org Kubernetes platform on Amazon, I think, so it's basically maintaining a number of servers, depending on how much activity is on Drupal.org, and if there are more people uploading patches, it's starting up some more servers and then shutting them down again. The infrastructure is provided by the Drupal Association. All of this testing stuff is fairly expensive, so keep that in mind. For your country projects, use it, but don't just use don't test every single PHP version, don't test every single database backend, unless you have a reason to. The configuration of GitlabCI is in a file called .gitlabci YAML. This is very nice because for Drupal CI, it's a user interface on Drupal.org. And if you're not a maintainer, you cannot even see what the current configuration is, and you can definitely not change it. As a file, if for a project that's not yet using GitlabCI, you can start a new issue, you can do an issue fork, add the file, tests will run, and if it's working, the maintainer can merge it. There is very nice documentation about all this that's currently actively being developed and improved. So you can look there and adjust it. Most of the time, you don't need to do that much. You start by creating an issue, adding an issue fork, and then you can, in the user interface, add a file. You can just type in there .gitlabci YAML, and GitLab will automatically show you suggestions, and then you just pick the default template in there. That will basically do the default process that you will see on the next slide. And you only need to adjust it or extend it if you want to. You can also just copy a file of a different project into that project and commit it. Works too. The default pipeline basically looks like this. So there are so-called, what I didn't mention yet, is there are also stages which group jobs into different stages. So first, the default process does a composer build of your module inside Drupal, inside the given desired Drupal version. Then it does a bunch of code syntax checks, PHP done, coding standards. As of this week, it also does a C-spell check for typos and words and so on. That's new, it's still a bit discussed. And then it runs your tests. If you have test fails, there are a few neat tools that you can use to investigate. So on the test tab of a pipeline, you can see the failing tests. You can click on the vDetails button, and then it will show you a window of the error message that caused error. Maybe that's enough to fix it. Maybe you can run it locally. Sometimes tests fail in different ways on CI. I'm sure you've all seen that if you work with CI. One thing you can do is that on the side of the PHP job, you can see that there's a job artifacts. You can download or browse that. And if you go in there, in the folder websites simple test browser output, you can find the generated HTML pages that your test visited. So if it reports, I cannot find this text, or this doesn't show up, I cannot find this button, then you can find the correct file, look at it, and you can see exactly what the tests are, and then fix it. You can do this locally as well, but again, sometimes the setup is a bit different, and it works for you locally. It doesn't work here, then you can look at those files. Can be really useful. Then you can customize this quite a bit. One useful thing, if you have a project with a number of tests, is to set the PHP concurrency variable to 1. This will use the run test script of Drupal core to run up to, I don't know, 20 or so tests in parallel. And using the default behavior currently is just running them one by one. This can be 10 times faster depending on your project. You can, by default, testing is done against the current Drupal version. So currently that's 10.2. You can opt in to testing with the previous minor or major version, and the same for the next version, and you can also test the max PHP version. So you can use some of these. I would probably, in most cases, you probably don't want all of them. It's probably enough to test maybe the current version, the next minor or major or so, to reduce the amount of tests. There are some alternatives. You can set up scheduled pipelines. So for example, you run all your tests once per week against the latest Drupal version to see if anything broke. And you can also do manual execution. So you can have the job there, but it's only executed if you press the button for it. The scheduled pipelines, once a project has merged the initial GitlabCI, you have a pipeline scheduler in GitLab that as a maintainer, this is again a maintainer thing. As a maintainer, you can then set it up. You can give it a name. You can tell it that there are some default options there, like run it every day, run it every week, run it every month. They're randomized a bit, so that's why it looks so strange, to like distribute the load so that not everyone is running the tests at Sunday night. And then you can change variables that you saw before as well. So you can, for example, run it with a different PHP version or a different Drupal core version. Small note, I only learned about this week as well. By default, GitLab seems to use the default no-reply email that's associated with your Drupal org account. So you don't get any emails if your scheduled pipelines are failing. To fix this, click on your profile icon, go to Preferences, and then Notifications, and there you can select which email should be used to send you notifications, and adjust for which actions you want to get emails. There's a lot more you can do with customizing. You can, for example, add additional services. So the Redis module needs a Redis server to function. I can now do this. I can just say, give me a Redis server that you can run tests against. You can adjust the composer build process. So by default, there's a lot of stuff that you can't do in your own composer repository. You cannot add additional repositories. You cannot add config, and dev dependencies by design are not added to a regular project. But the composer build job, is specifically built to support this. So it will include all your dev dependencies. You can have config, for example, for the simple SAML project, I need to allow a composer plugin or the composer install fails. I can just add that to my own composer JSON. There's no effect on any real installation, but on Drupal org, GitlabCI, it's included and used for testing. You can install additional packages. So the ImageMagick module needs the ImageMagick tool to test itself, and Redis needs the PHP extension, so you can install all those things on your test environment automatically. You can even use your own image. So by default, DrupalCI has their own DrupalCI, PHP, Apache templates image that they use, but you can customize this as well. So installing these packages can be fairly slow. You can set up your own image that have them pre-included. That's much faster to start. And the downside is that you have to keep those maintained, have to update them. So in most cases, you probably don't want that. We use this for our own projects that we test on our own GitlabCI. you can install JavaScript libraries. For example, the Dropzone module uses the composer base of the script to download the Dropzone library, move it to the right place, unzip it, and so on, and then the tests can use it and can rely on it. You might notice that I used a variable here for the version, because Dropzone wants to use different versions and test different versions. I can do that as well. So I can set up extra jobs. I can tell it, do the same as the other composer job, but use this variable. And then a PHP-init job that says depend on the composer Dropzone 6 build step, so that it runs against Dropzone 6. So I can test different versions of stuff by just setting up those fairly isolated small jobs. You can even have a test matrix. So the Redis project supports 3 different integrations. You can use the default PHP Redis extension. You can use a PHP implementation, pRedis. And for a while now, there is also a new extension called Relay that you can use as well. We test then all these different integrations in a loop, basically. So setting up this matrix will do that. You can also set up different jobs. This is just a shorthand to set up those 3 jobs. And for each matrix, you can then use different variables. This is fairly complex, but you can look up in the GitLab documentation and the Drupal.org documentation how to do stuff like this. This is a somewhat advanced use case, I think. Some notes on Drupal core. So this job stuff, this splitting up and matrix and so on, allowed the execution time of Drupal core tests to go from 1 hour plus to 12 minutes for all the Drupal core tests. It's done by running about 20 different jobs at the same time. So like the kernel tests are running 3 groups. The functional tests are running, 10 groups. So that each of them only takes about 10 minutes, so the total thing just takes 12 minutes. That's really, really useful, because if you contribute an issue, if you just have to wait 12 minutes to get feedback, you can get back to it much more quickly than having to wait 1 hour. There is also a test-only job that will come to contribution as well. What it does is basically detect changes to tests. And then the assumption is those were done to verify that the changes you did are now correctly working. So it just runs those test changes, and they're supposed to fail. And if they're failing, then that means your test changes are doing their job. And there are also some manual pipelines. So by default, Drupal just runs on MySQL, but you can just press a button to run it on PostgreSQL as well. If you do like SQL changes that might not work anymore on PostgreSQL, you can run those jobs as well. Then the last topic, this one is more for maintainers, but maybe some of you are not yet maintainers, so this might still be useful, but will become maintainers in the future. First, about branches. So most country projects, or many country projects, still follow the old structure, which was the Drupal core version .x dash the major version. This was because until Drupal 8, every major new Drupal core version was completely different, and you needed a mostly very different country module to work in those different core versions. That's changed since Drupal 8. You can usually run it with only small changes or even no changes between different major versions. There's a new way for that, and that's the SEMver approach, semantic versioning, and you can use 2 versions of that. One is you can just have a branch called 1.x or whatever.x, or you can do minor versions as well. You can do 1.0.x. My recommendation is to use 1.x because it allows you to create releases, to create tags for both patch and release versions. So using 1.x branch, you can first release 1.0.0, then you can release a patch release with some bug fixes, 1.0.1, and then without any new branches, you can just release 1.1.0. For example, if you release a version that's now compatible with Drupal 11. And you don't need multiple branches for this. If you need to, you can still branch off afterwards. So let's say you release 1.1.0, and then you need to do a security release, or you need to do a bug fix for 1.0 as well. Then you can still branch off and still tag 1.0.2 afterwards. Drupal has a concept called a release series. As a maintainer, that's something you set up on a project. And a release series for a semver branch is a minor release and it's patch releases. I will show a screenshot how that looks on the next screen. It can be supported and recommended, which changes if it shows up on the project page and which color it has. One special thing, one limitation of that approach with a single major branch is that it cannot be marked as supported and it cannot show up on a project page unless you have a tag. So if you do 10x, you can just do a development snapshot that's automatically updated and it shows up. If you follow the major branch approach, you need to have at least one tag, but I think that makes sense anyway because you probably don't want your users to use the development branch. You can still just have a development branch and it's still there, it will just not show up on the project page. You have to go look for it under all the releases. My recommendation is that it's a bit a tricky thing. So on one side, it makes sense to do those minor releases, but because you then need a new release series for those minor releases, you will be tempted to mark the old ones as no longer supported. The problem is that supported doesn't just hide it from the project page, it will also report in the update module on every single Drupal installation that the version they are using is no longer supported and they must immediately update. So my recommendation is to keep those minor releases as support no longer recommended, but as supported for some time until users have time to update to the new version. The cost of that is low. The worst case scenario, in my opinion, is that you might need to release a security fix for an old release, but even that, nobody is forcing you to do so. You can still decide it's not worth the effort to do an extra release. I have a security fix, people will need to update. The UI that I mentioned looks like this. So you have a list of those series. So this is from the Binder project, and it has a 4x major branch, because one thing I didn't mention is that you cannot restart from scratch. So if you had, in this case, you had 8x, 1, 2, 3, so we had to basically move to somewhere 4x. So we have a 4x branch, and then we have 3 minor branches, 4.0, 4.1, 4.2. 4.0 and 4.2 are supported, and 4.2 is recommended. That then results in this look, this display on the project page. We have the recommended version in green, and below is the yellow version that's still supported but not recommended. This can also be useful if you, for example, need to make a change to be compatible with Drupal 11 that for some reason isn't compatible with Drupal 10 anymore. We're trying really hard to avoid that, but sometimes it's necessary. Then you can do a new minor version that requires Drupal 11, and Drupal 10 users can still stay on the old minor version. Now, when should you release a minor version? Basically, when you have new features, especially if they require user attention. Then you might have a new default setting, or so that users might want to check and confirm that it works for them. If you change your dependencies, if you require a new Drupal core version, a new version of a different module, a new PHP version, then it makes sense to do a minor release. And yes, if you update your project, basically it's like a rolling phase. So when Drupal 9 came out, projects switched to requiring, let's say, at least Drupal 8.9 and Drupal 9. And now when Drupal 10 came out, most modules switched to like requiring Drupal 9.4 or Drupal 10. For this, you don't need a new major version. It's enough to have a minor version update that is compatible with the semantic versioning, because the only time you have to create a major release is when you have BC breaks in your own API. And just like somewhat related to minor versions, I recommend doing new major versions rarely, because even more so than minor versions, it usually takes years for a large number of Drupal sites to update to that new version. It requires manual testing and updating Composer JSON and so on. And people usually often just don't do that unless they need to. For example, at some point, maybe only the new major version supports Drupal 11. So they will need to at some point, but it can take a long time. And then as a maintainer, you have two options. One is you can just cut them off, and then again, they will get a warning that they are no longer on a supported version, or you have to maintain 2 or even more major versions over a long time. Commits. So the recommendation is that you do a single commit per issue. So when it's done and finished, you do a single commit. The commit message usually looks like this, that you have issue, the number by some contributors, and then the description. There's some discussion over that, especially in the past. The contributors' commit message log was parsed to then tell this person had so many commits on Drupal core and this person had so many. That's not done anymore. There's a separate Drupal org UI. So for the information on your profile that says you contributed to 10 Drupal core issues, this is irrelevant, doesn't matter anymore. So you can leave it out. I think it has some useful benefits that I will get to later. And what you should do is review and adjust the issue credits. So for the maintainer, there is a table, a box, I'll show that screenshot of that in a few slides, that will allow you to say, yes, these and these persons did useful contributions to the issue, I'm giving them credit. There are some trends that certain people, or even bots, I don't know, do stuff that makes no sense, like they upload screenshots that the patch applied, or they upload patches from the merge request so they can use it in Composer, which you shouldn't do anymore. You might not want to give those people credit. There's a very neat feature that if you use merge requests, almost done. You can basically select in the user interface on Drupal org, pick the merge request, click the merge button. It will use the merge message that you can see now on this screen. And then you can, this is the credits. You can see the people who contributed an issue. You can check them or uncheck them. And it gives you a copy-paste command if you still have a patch. Or you can use the merge UI there. You can also merge on GitLab itself. Keep in mind that by default, it will not use this merge message. So if you want to do that, you have to copy-paste it over there. And then last slide, second last slide. When you do a release, include release notes. It really helps to understand other people what changed in the release. They can look up what changed. There are some nice tools for this. There's the Drupal org CLI with the amaran command. This creates like a default look that lists all the issues, contributors, and so on. There's also a website that can do the same. I usually use an alias that basically just picks the last 2 Git tags, does a curl request, and then just prints out the template. So I just have to type amaran, enter, and it gives me the release notes. And the release notes look like this, that the tool creates. So at the top, you have room for a customized summary of the changes. You have the highlighted contributors, which I think is a really nice feature, and then the list of changes since the last release. Okay, that's it. Are there any questions, inputs? Guess not.
A question, so there was a trend that people moved to GitHub, and now everything is in GitLab. Like in your day-to-day work, do you see most of the contribution happening now, like as regularly on GitLab, or is it still like, are still modules on different spaces in the ecosystem?
I think the majority of modules always stayed on Drupal org. And as far as I know, a few came back because Drupal org has now improved tooling. Like they moved to GitHub because they had the more advanced CI use cases. I think Searchable Solar is still on GitHub because it has some very complex CI setup where it sets up multiple different Solar servers. Might be possible now in GitlabCI as well. I think that's one example that's using GitHub. I think most projects moved back to Drupal org to GitLab, and I think that's a good thing. Anything else?
If not, we have time now to go to the reception where we all get out of the building for the group photo. Thanks, Sasha, for your session.